The alien queen cat girl purred at him. Now she's begging to be his mate. He stands at the edge of the throne room, breath stilled by the hush of gold-paneled walls and the lingering aroma of incense that clings to every gilded column. Their eyes lock, his, cold and calculating, hers, fiercely amused. Light from the high windows spills across the ornate floor, reflecting on her inked skin. His heartbeat hammers in his ears. He can't remember the last time an enemy made him pause like this. Her feline ears flick almost imperceptibly, and a slow, mocking smile curves her lips, as though she's already won. Then she tips her head, and he senses the challenge coiling between them, unspoken but undeniable. "Is that the best weapon you brought, human?" she purrs, the low resonance of her voice humming through his veins. "Or were you hoping to surrender between my thighs instead?" The words land like a physical strike, daring him to react. For a beat, he remains frozen, fighting the disorienting pull of her presence. He tilts his head, that unconscious gesture he's done countless times before a kill. He never thought he'd do it while looking at someone like her. Finally, he murmurs, "Didn't think you'd beg so soon." The hush that follows is charged, and neither moves, each waiting for the other to break. She moves first, launching forward with breathtaking speed. He blocks, steel against her sharpened claws. Sparks fly, a flurry of violence that sweeps through the chamber. He circles, she counters, and in the dance of combat he feels her heartbeat matching his. The clash reverberates through the palace corridors, echoing off carved pillars. Every blow she delivers tests him, every feint invites him to fail. He meets her challenge head-on, adrenaline scorching through his muscles. She's faster than he expected, more agile, each movement laced with a lethal grace. Yet he refuses to yield. A sudden twist, and he manages to grab her wrist, slamming her against a marble column. She snarls, baring sharp canines, and that primal sound resonates with an ache deep in his gut. Her eyes flash gold, pupils contracting in fierce concentration. She raises her free hand, and for an instant, her nails skim along his jaw, not striking, just grazing. The threat is there, a whisper of violence. He presses his blade to her throat. "You're cornered," he growls, breath labored, sweat slicking his brow. She just laughs, a sound that makes his skin tingle, and he can't decide if it's anger or something else. He feels an odd tremor in the air, a barely perceptible vibration emanating from her. It's a purr, but deeper, almost hypnotic. He's never encountered anything like it, and the way it crawls through his skull makes his grip falter for the briefest second. Sensing his hesitation, she twists free. Before he can blink, she's flipped him, pinning him against the cold floor. Her thighs squeeze his hips, claws at his throat. "You're trembling, Kale," she murmurs, her voice laced with that subsonic vibration. "Careful. I might start thinking you enjoy this." He grimaces, refusing to acknowledge that flicker of heat in his veins. She stares down at him, hair falling around her face like midnight curtains, ears angled forward to catch every ragged breath he takes. Outside, he hears the distant rumble of explosions, reminders of the war that's ravaged his home, stripped him of everything he knew. Her presence should be fueling his hatred, but it's doing something more complex. He's locked in a tangle of contradictory impulses, kill her or keep her. She leans in, her breath warm against his cheek. "Will you yield?" she whispers, and he can sense the triumph in her voice, certain he won't dare. He bares his teeth, forcing a scoff. "I'd rather die." And in the shifting chaos of their entwined bodies he manages a surge of strength. He bucks upward, toppling her off. The dance of violence continues, a whirlwind of near misses and punishing blows. Her laughter cuts through it all, each note a daring invitation. He tries to steady his own breathing, but the flood of sensations keeps battering him. He was here to kill her, to end the Ziri Queen and avenge his past, but she's not what he imagined. She's a force of nature wrapped in regal beauty, and she's no stranger to combat. Then something shifts in the air. Reinforcements pour into the hall, armed guards shouting orders, weapons primed. Their faces are obscured by metallic masks, each moving in precise formation. She hisses under her breath, a flick of her ear revealing her annoyance. He doesn't hesitate, pivoting to slice through the first wave of attackers. She flanks him, claws ripping through armor, silver arcs of lethal grace. For an instant, they fight as a unit, despite their earlier clash. The guards are well trained, but Kale and the Queen are lethal. Sparks ignite under flickering chandeliers, the entire palace descending into chaos. They dispatch the guards, panting in the aftermath. There's a tense, shared look, both acknowledging that something bigger is afoot. He flicks his gaze around, searching for an exit. She grits her teeth and gestures behind him. More footsteps, heavier. A second wave is inbound. He feels adrenaline spike, scanning for options. She's the target. If these new arrivals succeed, they'll take her. He can't let that happen, not yet. He needs her alive to end the war from within. But if they stand and fight, they'll be overwhelmed. She steps close, voice low. We've got to move. Unless you'd rather face an army. He narrows his eyes. Running with the enemy queen was never part of his plan, but the alternative is being captured or killed. Without a word, he nods, and they sprint through the palace corridors. Her bare feet move soundlessly on polished marble, his boots thudding in counterpoint. She leads him through hidden passages, each turn revealing more opulent decor, vaulted ceilings painted with cosmic murals, statues carved to immortalize past rulers. He notices how her tail flicks in agitation, betraying her frustration. She's not used to this position, forced into flight, reliant on a human to watch her back. He can feel the tension radiating off her. A sudden turn brings them face to face with another squad of guards. Shouts ring out, weapons raised, but Nyxara just snarls, and Kale catches the subtle shift of her weight as she prepares to strike. He grips her shoulder, pulling her back before she can leap. Don't be reckless, he says, his voice harsh. She glares, but the purr in her throat rumbles again, and he almost falters. He bites down the sense of vertigo, forcing himself to stay clear-headed. Together they pivot, weaving through side corridors until they burst onto a narrow balcony overlooking the palace gardens. Below, the courtyard swarms with soldiers. There's no easy escape. He glances over the railing, measuring the distance, while she stands behind him, silent, predatory. Her tattoos catch the moonlight, giving them a faint luminescence. She presses a control panel near the balcony door, revealing a retractable rope ladder sliding down the outer wall. She's planned for this. He gives her a questioning look, but she just smirks, stepping onto the railing with feline agility. The moment her foot touches the top rung, she looks back at him, gold eyes gleaming. Try to keep up, soldier. He grimaces, slinging his blade across his back and following her downward. The night air whips past, carrying the scent of smoke from distant fires. He can hear voices shouting above, the alarm raised. Arrows whistle through the dark, clattering against the stone. One nearly grazes his ear, forcing him to grip the ladder tighter. She drops the final few feet, landing in a crouch, tail swishing. As he lands beside her, their eyes meet. Despite the tension, a flicker of something else passes between them, an unspoken awareness that they're now bound by necessity. They dart between statues and meticulously manicured hedges, avoiding searchlights. Her steps are impossibly light, and he finds himself studying the elegant lines of her body, the ripple of muscle under alien markings. He hates that he notices. This is the woman who led the empire that destroyed his world. She's supposed to be a monster, yet every time their gazes collide, he feels an undercurrent of primal recognition. Her lips part, and she glances at him over her shoulder. You're bleeding, she observes, voice carrying a note of challenge. He brushes the wet warmth at his side, only now registering the cut. I'll live, he mutters. The clash of steel and the thunder of boots on gravel interrupt any further exchange. More guards flood the garden, and she tenses, scanning for a path of escape. He grabs her wrist. This way, he snaps, ducking into the shadow of a towering statue. She bares her teeth at his touch, but follows. They press against the cold stone, the guard's footsteps just beyond. He can feel her breath on the back of his neck. Her purr vibrates again, gentler this time, like a hidden warning. Any moment, they could be discovered. But the tension is thick, and he's acutely aware of her body behind his. One of the guards nearly passes their hiding spot. She shifts slightly, claws grazing his forearm. A silent message: stay still. He holds his breath, listening to the guard's armor clink. A few more seconds, and the patrol moves on. He releases a pent-up exhale, and she does the same. Their reprieve is short-lived, as more searchlights sweep the courtyard. He moves to bolt, but she catches his shoulder, yanking him back. She points to a dark archway at the far side. We go together, she breathes. He nods, ignoring the way his pulse pounds at her closeness. Then they run. They reach the archway, slipping into a network of passageways beneath the gardens. It smells of damp stone and old secrets. Flickering torches light the path sporadically, casting long, dancing shadows. She seems to know the route, guiding him wordlessly. Footsteps echo behind them, the chase unrelenting. They press on until the corridor opens into a small chamber with a heavy iron door at the far side. She hurries to a control panel, punching in a sequence. The door groans open, revealing the night sky beyond, along with a whiff of polluted city air. He hesitates at the threshold, scanning the dark expanse. The city lights in the distance flicker over a war-torn horizon. She pushes past him, striding out as if she owns the night. He notices how her shoulders remain tense, her posture braced for the next onslaught. He steels himself, stepping through. Whatever temporary alliance they've formed is uneasy at best, but it's all they have. He glances back at the palace, where alarms still echo, then at the woman who was supposed to be his mark. We'll never make it on foot, he says flatly. She whips her gaze to him, eyes narrowing, yet there's a grudging acceptance. I know where we can find transport. They set off into the city ruins, the stench of burning metal and scorched earth heavy in the air. Buildings loom, half demolished, windows shattered. The broken skeleton of a once grand metropolis. She navigates the debris with feline grace, while he keeps watch, blade ready. Occasionally, a distant explosion punctures the silence, reminding them of the raging conflict. As they press deeper, the tension between them doesn't subside. Instead, it crackles, alive, refusing to be ignored. With every breath he takes, he's aware of her presence, her intoxicating scent, that subtle hum in her voice, the fierce gleam in her eye. He doesn't want to think about it, but it's there, lingering at the edges of his mind, the fact that when he had her pinned, he hesitated. No matter how hard he tries to deny it, something about her is compelling in a way he can't explain. She, too, seems to feel the tug. Despite her razor-edged remarks, she stays close, occasionally looking at him with a keen, calculating stare. Their alliance is one of necessity, but beneath that, an electric current runs, drawing them together and pushing them apart in equal measure. They scramble over a collapsed wall, and she pauses, surveying the streets. This way, she finally says, voice hushed. They wind through back alleys, avoiding the main roads where squads of soldiers patrol. At a narrow dead end, she kneels beside a hidden hatch. With a deft press of a panel, it slides open, revealing a maintenance shaft. She goes first, dropping into the darkness. He follows, landing in a knee-deep puddle of stagnant water. The stench nearly makes him gag, but she presses on without complaint, leading him through the subterranean passage. At the far end, faint illumination spills from above. She climbs a rusted ladder and shoulders open a metal grate. When they emerge, they find themselves in a deserted storage bay, shelves stocked with crates of spare parts, half of them battered. A single small craft sits in the center, hull scorched but seemingly intact. She stalks toward it, eyes narrowed in appraisal. It should fly, she murmurs. He places a hand on its plating, feeling the residual heat from an old engine. We'll see. The sound of distant footfalls echoes from beyond the bay doors, spurring them to move faster. He helps her pry open the craft's cockpit. She slides into the pilot's seat, working the controls with swift confidence. Lights flare, systems whir. He glances over his shoulder at the door. Any second, the enemy could burst through. Finally, the engine sputters to life. She looks up at him, silent invitation. He steps inside, stowing his blade. The cockpit's cramped, forcing him close to her side. Her ear flicks, brushing his cheek. He ignores the jolt that shoots through him. "Go," he says, voice tight. She guns the engine, and the craft lurches into motion, ripping through the bay doors in a shower of sparks. Night air engulfs them as they ascend, the city's shattered skyline passing beneath. Searchlights sweep across the sky, but she maneuvers with expert skill, keeping them below the main patrols. He grips the back of her seat, anger and relief warring inside him. This is the woman he came to kill, a queen whose armies slaughtered his people. Yet here they are, fleeing together into the night. His mind spins with confusion, fueled by the lingering vibrations of her purse still buzzing in his memory. She sets a course away from the densest fighting, scanning readouts on the console. "I need to land somewhere safe," she mutters. "We can't stay airborne long. This craft is running on fumes." He nods, eyes flicking across the city below. Smoke and fire light the streets, a grim testament to the war. He can't help the bitterness that rises in his throat. Vengeance was supposed to be straightforward. But nothing about her presence is simple. She arcs them toward the outskirts, where the city meets the wasteland. A hush settles between them, either wanting to voice the uneasy pact they've formed. At last, she guides the ship to a secluded stretch of rubble near the city's old perimeter wall. She lands with a rough thud. Alarms on the console flash red, indicating an imminent fuel failure. She kills the engine, leaning back in the seat with a hard exhale. He pries the cockpit open, scanning the darkness around them. Silence, except for the distant rumble of artillery. She slides out, and they stand there for a moment, battered from the night's frenzy, each one reluctant to lower their guard. Finally, he breaks the stillness. "Why didn't you kill me back there?" She narrows her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. Her tattoos glimmer faintly under the starlight, the shapes coiling like living shadows. "Because I'd rather keep you on a leash, soldier. At least for now." He tenses, half expecting her to purr, but she merely smirks and turns away, as though dismissing him. His jaw sets, a simmer of anger stirring. Yet despite himself, he can't quell a flicker of respect for her audacity. She's outnumbered, hunted, and still she holds herself like a monarch. Maybe that's what makes her so dangerous. They move to find shelter in the crumbling remains of a nearby building. The roof has caved in, leaving one relatively intact corner that provides partial cover. It's better than the open air. He clears debris while she checks her arm for scratches, flexing her claws. She runs a hand over her inky tattoos, and in the moonlight, they almost seem to shimmer with a life of their own. He forces himself to look away, focusing on their surroundings. "I'll take first watch," he says curtly, bracing himself against a chunk of broken wall. She doesn't argue, just sinks down near him in a posture that might be rest or might be a coiled readiness to strike. Minutes drag by. He watches her from the corner of his eye, noticing the way her chest rises and falls, the tension in her shoulders never fully easing. She's every bit as much on guard as he is. Together, they listen to the far-off thunder of battle, the occasional whoosh of ships overhead. He tries not to think about how her purr felt against his skin, tries not to dwell on the fact that, for a moment, her thighs had pinned him to the ground and he wasn't sure he wanted to break free. Eventually, dawn's first light begins to illuminate the rubble, turning the edges of broken concrete to pale gold. She stirs, blinking as she wakes. He notices the subtle twitch of her ears, the arch of her spine. She glances at him, still crouched and alert. "You didn't sleep," she states. He shrugs. "I've gone longer without." She unfolds her legs, rising to her feet with a languid grace that betrays her feline nature. Then she steps forward, gaze unblinking, scanning his face. "You have a name," she says. "I heard your men call you Kale." He nods, not offering more. She smirks. "What are you after, Kale?" He's not ready to reveal the full depth of his vendetta. So he just holds her stare. "You." The admission rings in the still air, layered with more meaning than he intended. She tilts her head, a spark of intrigue lighting her features. "Then come and claim me." She purrs softly, turning away to stride out into the morning light. He exhales, silent, steeling himself. Every instinct screams that he's treading on dangerous ground. She's the figurehead of everything he despises, the Ziri dominion, the empire that razed his home and stole his future. Yet she's also the key to his vengeance, a path to dismantling her entire regime from the inside. And damn it all, there's something about her that sets his blood on fire. He retrieves his blade, slinging it across his back. If she thinks she can toy with him, she has no idea who she's dealing with. They venture into the abandoned streets, finding an old hoverbike half buried in debris. While he works to salvage power cells, she stands on high alert, scanning for threats. A short, grudging exchange of information passes between them. She needs to reclaim her throne, but a powerful faction within her own ranks has orchestrated a coup. Kale seizes on the opportunity. If he can help her crush the coup, perhaps he can twist her power to broker peace, or exact final revenge. She watches him carefully, as though she can guess his plans. Yet she neither stops him nor confronts him. She merely says, "On Nixara," a name that rolls off her tongue with a regal cadence. He tries to read her expression, but there's nothing that suggests fear. If anything, she seems impatient, like a predator who wants the next hunt to begin. He powers the bike, testing the throttle. The engine sputters, then roars. She glides onto the seat behind him with effortless grace, pressing close enough that he feels the heat of her body. "I don't trust you," he says over his shoulder, revving the engine. Her breath warms his ear. "I wouldn't trust me either," she replies, smirking. As the bike shoots forward, they speed through ravaged streets littered with wreckage. Occasionally, they pass groups of scavengers who watch from a distance, unwilling to provoke two lethal-looking figures. Nixara's arms circle his waist, claws never quite sheathed, a silent reminder of her threat. He tries to ignore the press of her body, the faint purr resonating through his spine. Every moment feels like another line on a battlefield, each breath a gamble in this precarious alliance. At length, they reach a devastated sector near the city's perimeter. Rows of collapsed buildings create a twisted maze of rubble. She motions for him to stop outside what used to be a towering structure, now reduced to half its height. "Old Ziri intelligence post," she explains curtly. "We might find data logs about the coup, if the servers survived." He kills the engine, scanning the wreckage. "Or we might find an ambush." She bares her teeth in a grin. "Then I hope you're ready to fight." They dismount, and the tension crackles again as they move in tandem. She leads the way, stepping over broken girders. He follows, blade at the ready, eyes flicking across every shadow. The stench of decay mingles with the tang of scorched electronics. Wires spark in the darkness like dying fireflies. A ghostly hush blankets the sight, broken only by the crackle of broken screens. She advances, posture tense, ears swiveling to catch the slightest noise. Inside, they find corridors half blocked by debris. He shoulders aside a twisted steel beam so she can pass, ignoring how his muscles burn. She slips through with predatory ease, glancing back to watch him with curiosity. "You move like a beast," she observes. He doesn't reply, but the faint twitch of his mouth suggests he takes it as a compliment. They push deeper, the flicker of failing emergency lights casting everything in a sickly hue. Then, out of nowhere, movement. Figures erupt from the rubble, armed with energy rifles. She dives to the side, hissing. He lunges forward, blade flashing. The next few seconds blur into a brutal dance. Gunfire scorches the air, but he's used to it, weaving between bursts of plasma. She uses her claws with merciless efficiency, slashing throats, purring when she senses fear. They dispatch the attackers quickly, but the fight leaves him panting, sweat dripping down his brow. She's unscathed, though her chest heaves, adrenaline coursing. She steps over a fallen foe, scanning the corridor. "I knew it," she mutters. "They're already here, searching for intel." He nods, wiping blood from his blade onto his pant leg. "Then let's not waste time." They find a corridor leading to the server room. It's sealed behind a reinforced door. She tries the control panel, but it's locked out. He snarls in frustration. Another wave of footsteps grows closer behind them. They're running out of time. With her tail swishing in agitation, she sidesteps, motioning to him. Give me cover. He braces himself, weapon in hand, while she digs into the control panel. The old electronics spark and hiss as she tries to bypass them. The footsteps approach fast. He sets his jaw, ready to fight if needed. Her purr hums in the background, oddly focusing. At the last second, the door whooshes open, and they tumble inside. She slams the panel again, locking it behind them. The server room is a cavern of charred terminals. Only one console flickers with faint power. She heads straight for it, letting her claws tap at the screen. He stands behind her, scanning the door for any sign of forced entry. The purr in her throat rises and falls, an undercurrent to the frantic beat of his heart. He can't tell if it's a sign of concentration or a subtle attempt to unnerve him. He tries to ignore the effect it has on his nerves, but his fists clench around his weapon. Anything? He finally demands. She exhales, scanning lines of alien script. Yes. Evidence of the coup. Coordinates, safe houses. Enough to prove who's betraying me, and enough to topple them. He nods once. Then we broadcast it, end this war. She spins, eyes narrowing, hair swirling around her in a silky wave. End it? You think this data will simply bring peace? Her tone bristles with contempt. I need to show strength, to reclaim my throne. Only then can I decide who lives and dies. He takes a step closer, steel in his voice. Your throne cost my people everything. She locks gazes with him, lips curling into a sneer. And your people fought back, slaughtering mine in return. You think vengeance belongs only to you? They stand chest to chest, the tension thicker than ever. Hatred, desire, desperation, they fuse into a single electric charge. His breath rasps in his chest. She doesn't flinch, and for a heartbeat, he's tempted to tear the data from her, take it for himself. But her tail lashes, her eyes pin him, and he remembers that she's as dangerous as he is. Yet they're allies now, even if tenuously. This alliance, he growls, is about necessity. Don't forget that. She lifts her chin, voice dripping with challenge. I never forget. A loud pounding on the sealed door interrupts their standoff. The enemy is trying to breach. He curses under his breath. She quickly extracts the data onto a small device, slipping it into a pouch at her hip. We're done here, she says coldly. The door groans, red-hot lines forming as plasma torches cut through the metal. He motions to an emergency hatch in the corner. She nods, and they hurry to it. He pries it open, revealing a ventilation shaft that slopes downward. Without hesitation, she drops inside, her lithe body disappearing into the darkness. He follows, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. Once again, he's diving deeper into unknown territory at the side of his sworn enemy, who now might be his only hope. They crawl through the shaft, hearing the door finally give way behind them. Shouts echo, but they're too far gone. The shaft leads them into a massive underground tunnel system, likely used for transporting secret cargo. She scans the darkness, her pupils widening, adjusting to the lack of light. He flicks on a small lamp from his belt, and the beam pierces the gloom. Dripping water and the scuttle of vermin greet them. She says nothing, though he senses her distaste. As they move deeper, the tension simmers unspoken. They've shed blood together now. She's teased him, threatened him, saved his life, and withheld the killing blow. He's pinned her to a wall and promised death. Somewhere in the blur of violence, their bodies learned each other's rhythms. There's a savage thrill in that closeness, a certainty that they're matched in ferocity. Yet each time he glances at her, he can't help noticing the subtle curve of her body, the gleam of her tattoos, the graceful way she moves. He clenches his jaw, reminding himself who she is. And she? She peers back at him with that unsettling smirk, as if daring him to let his guard down just a fraction. When they finally emerge from the tunnel, they step into a half-collapsed underground hangar. Old ships and vehicles litter the space, gathering dust. She moves among them, searching for something usable. He stands watch, weary and battered, but still running on adrenaline. At last, she stops by a sleek cruiser with battered wings. "If we fix it, we can travel off-world," she says quietly. He arches a brow, scanning the hull. "We'll need parts. Fuel." She gestures to a row of crates. "They're here somewhere. We'll need time to make repairs." He nods, rolling his shoulders. They're effectively trapped in this underground bunker until they can get the cruiser flight ready. "We'll have to fight off anyone who finds us," he remarks, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. She tilts her head, a slow, predatory grin forming. "I'm counting on it." Her gaze lingers on him a moment longer than necessary, a silent statement that the real fight might be between them. Then she turns, tail swishing. "We should rest while we can. Repairs will be easier with daylight above ground." He helps her set up a makeshift camp in a corner of the hangar, clearing debris and piling crates into rudimentary barriers. She locates an old portable heater, coaxing it back to life, and soon a feeble glow illuminates their cramped corner. They sit across from each other, the hum of the heater filling the silence. He notices how the dim light plays over her features, accentuating the angular lines of her cheekbones and the delicate softness of her lips. She catches him staring, and her lips curve in a knowing smirk. He averts his gaze, focusing on unsheathing his blade to inspect it for damage. She watches him, arms draped over her knees, purring softly in the back of her throat. He curses inwardly at the way that sound gnaws at his composure. "So," she says at last, "did you enjoy our little dance in the palace?" He keeps his face impassive, sliding the whetstone along the blade. "I enjoyed not dying." She laughs, a throaty sound. "You're not the only one." The subtext hangs in the air. They both know how close each fight came to a lethal blow. Yet neither delivered it, as if something more potent than hatred kept them locked in that lethal ballet. Time drags on, exhaustion weighing on their limbs. Still, either truly sleeps. Any moment, the enemy could descend. He stands guard while she closes her eyes, though he suspects she's not fully at rest. Occasionally, her ears flick at a distant clank or rumble. He stares at the battered cruiser, mind churning with conflicting thoughts. This is it, he tells himself, a chance to sabotage her, to end her reign. But if she dies, the war rages on. If she lives, there might be a path to an end. It's maddening. When she opens her eyes, he notices a flicker of something akin to vulnerability in her gaze, as though the realities of her precarious situation have finally caught up with her. It's gone in an instant, replaced by that imperious lift of her chin. She rises, crossing to inspect the cruiser's engine. He joins her, scanning the archaic readouts. "We'll have to replace these conduits," he mutters, half to himself. She nods, hooking a claw through a broken wire. "And purge the fuel lines. Ziri engines are sensitive if left idle." Her purr rises, but this time it's a low rumble of concentration. They work side by side for hours, tearing apart crates in search of compatible parts. Tension smolders in every brush of fingers, every accidental meeting of eyes. She comments on his technique, mocking his primitive methods, while he shoots back insults about Ziri arrogance. Beneath the barbs, a strange camaraderie forms. They're both skilled, both survivors. The cruiser begins to take shape, and with each repaired system, they inch closer to potential escape. He's careful not to let his guard slip, but there's a sense of shared purpose now. He needs her to accomplish his goal, and perhaps she needs him more than she'll admit. By the time they finish the day's work, they're drained. She collapses against a crate, tail curling around her ankles. He slides down a wall, wincing at the ache in his ribs. Silence settles, and he finds himself watching her again. Her inky black hair, the subtle luminescence of her tattoos, the graceful lines of her arms. Even battered and grimy from the day's labor, she radiates an otherworldly allure that prickles along his nerve endings. She seems to sense his stare, and her eyes flick open, glowing faintly in the low light. "I feel your tension," she murmurs, her voice like a warm whisper of wind. "Is it just hatred? Or is there something else?" He tightens his jaw, refusing to answer. She exhales, soft laughter dancing in the air. We're not so different, you and I. Both of us have lost. Both of us fight to keep what little power we have left. He shifts, pushing himself to his feet, every muscle protesting. Save your speeches, Queen. She rises, too, chin lifted in regal defiance. Oh, I don't waste words on just anyone, Kale. Her purr resonates again, filling the silence with its haunting timbre. He hates the way it stirs his blood, how it seizes his focus. But he can't deny the raw, magnetic pull between them, even if he resents it. They draw closer, tension vibrating in the scant space that separates them. His heart pounds, and for a split second, he wonders if she'll strike. Instead, she brushes a hand across his collarbone, her nails scraping lightly, sending a shiver through him. He grabs her wrist, eyes flashing. She smirks. You're tired. Let go. Her voice is a velvet command. He releases her, stepping back, swallowing the lump in his throat. You're right, he mutters, forcing his gaze away. She turns, climbing atop a crate, curled in a position that's almost cat-like, and closes her eyes. He leans against the wall, sword within reach, gaze flicking toward her occasionally. This uneasy truce hums with potential betrayal. Yet the more time he spends near her, the more that hatred tangles with something primal. Maybe she's more cunning than he thought, using her alien allure to distract him. Or maybe the seeds of something else have been planted in this wreckage, something unstoppable. He can't decide, and the uncertainty gnaws at him. He inhales the stale air, letting the tension settle in his bones. Tomorrow, they'll resume repairs, and soon they'll head off-world. She'll try to reclaim her throne, and he'll try to harness that power for an end to the conflict. Or maybe he'll bury a blade in her back. Nothing is certain. Except one truth, each time their paths cross, the sparks fly brighter. The threat of betrayal lingers, but so does an undercurrent of desire that neither can fully suppress. By the time he allows himself a moment's rest, the night is silent except for the hum of a single lamp. He keeps one eye open, listening to her steady breathing, aware of every soft movement she makes. It's a war on all fronts, against the Dominion, the coup, and against the pull between them. Yet in that hush, something else slips in, the possibility that they might not be able to resist each other forever. And that single thought both terrifies and exhilarates him as he drifts into uneasy sleep. When morning comes, he's first to rise. Old habits die hard, his body accustomed to snapping awake at the slightest shift. She's still curled up on the crate, her hair spilling over one shoulder, her lashes resting on sculpted cheeks. That fleeting vulnerability makes his chest tighten. Then her eyes open, gold irises sharpening, and the moment is shattered. How long was I out? She demands, stretching in a languorous arch that makes him swallow hard. Not long enough, he answers gruffly, turning away to gather supplies. She drops down, landing soundlessly beside him. They resume repairs, the day passing in a grueling slog of labor. Each time they pause, scanning for threats, they share a tense glance. He can practically feel her mind churning with strategies. How to use him, how to ensure he doesn't turn on her. He's thinking much the same. Yet in those shared tasks, there's an undeniable synchronicity in how they move, how they anticipate each other's needs, passing tools, hoisting parts, fending off the occasional patrol that wanders into the bunker. By dusk, the cruiser is close to flight ready. They work until their hands are smeared with grease and dust. When finally they collapse, sweaty and exhausted, they look at each other in the dying light. Her ears lie flat, her breathing ragged. He can see the faint tremor in her limbs, a sign of fatigue she probably hates revealing. He's not much better, chest heaving, arms burning from hours of wrenching metal. She leans back, pressing her spine against the cruiser's hull. Tomorrow, she says quietly, we'll see if we can escape this wretched city and reach my stronghold. He nods, wiping sweat from his brow. The quiet that follows is heavy with what remains unsaid, the risk, the alliance, the tether of anger, and something else. He rummages through the crates for rations, tossing her a small package. She catches it without looking, tearing it open with a claw. They eat in silence, the bland taste of survival fueling their tired bodies. Sometime in the night, A distant explosion rattles the bunker. Dust falls from the ceiling in choking clouds. She stiffens, ears pricked, tail lashing. He grips his blade. But nothing comes. The tension doesn't fade, though. They're both thinking about how precarious this is. If the Dominion or the coup forces locate them, they'll be pinned down. If they escape, they'll face a battlefield in the skies. Finally, when the threat passes, she glances at him. "You never asked me why I want to keep my throne," she says, voice subdued. He shrugs, avoiding her gaze. "It's not my concern." She laughs, a humorless sound. "You think it's just about power. Maybe it was, once. But I have reasons you can't imagine." He meets her eyes, seeing a glint of something deeper than arrogance. Before he can speak, she adds, "Don't bother. I don't want your sympathy, Kale." Then she turns away, shutting him out again. He clenches his jaw, focusing on the tasks ahead. They can't afford to dwell on personal histories or open old wounds. But her words linger in his mind like a subtle echo, suggesting that maybe, beneath that deadly exterior, she has her own burdens. He hates that he's curious, hates that he wants to peel back her layers. Vengeance was supposed to be clear-cut. Now it's tangled with the purr of her voice and the memory of her body pressed against his in the throne room. They settle into another uneasy night, both sleeping in shifts, half watching each other in the dim light. Each time he drifts off, he dreams of the palace battle, her claws at his throat, his blade at her heart, the charge that shot through him when her thigh locked around his waist. He wakes up restless, unsheathing and resheathing his sword just to keep his hands busy. She watches him from under half-lowered lids, silent, assessing. Morning arrives in a slow crawl of dusty light, filtering through the cracks in the bunker walls. Without a word, they pick up where they left off, double-checking the cruiser's systems. Fuel cells are precarious but should hold for a single off-world jump. She adjusts the pilot's seat, tail flicking in irritation when a bolt refuses to tighten. He steps in, finishing the job. Their fingers brush, and for a moment, they freeze, locked in a shared breath. She doesn't pull away. Neither does he. The tension surges, dense enough to choke them both. Then she flicks her gaze down, breaks contact, and moves on. At last, the moment of truth arrives. He stands beside the cruiser, heart pounding. She checks the thrusters, the engine whining in protest before it stabilizes into a subdued roar. "Get in," she orders. He obeys, more from necessity than submission. The cockpit feels familiar now, though the seat still forces them close. Her hair brushes his face as she powers the takeoff sequence. She leans forward, tapping commands into the console, and he can't help noticing the graceful arc of her spine, the slope of her shoulder, the constant flick of her ears as she processes each new beep and warning on the screen. The engines roar, drowning out the pounding of his pulse. Dust and debris swirl around them as the craft lifts off. She grimaces, fighting the controls to keep them steady. They rocket upward, slicing through the collapsed ceiling of the bunker in a rush of adrenaline and crumbling mortar. Then they burst into open sky. The city stretches below, a patchwork of destruction. Columns of smoke rise where battles still rage. He scans for threats, spotting a few Dominion fighters patrolling. She curses softly, adjusting their trajectory to avoid a direct confrontation. One of the fighters peels away, heading straight for them. "Brace!" she hisses, accelerating. Kale grips the seat, eyes narrowing as the fighter's lasers illuminate the cockpit with harsh flashes. She jerks the controls, rolling them sideways. The craft shudders, an alarm blaring. He holds his breath, praying the repairs hold. Another burst of laser fire grazes their wing, sending a shower of sparks across the viewport. She snarls, diving low over the city. The fighter follows, weaving through half-collapsed skyscrapers in pursuit. Kale glances at the console. "We don't have weapons?" She shakes her head, purr intensifying in frustration. "None that work. Keep your eyes open, maybe we can outmaneuver them." He scans the environment, heart hammering. They dodge around a crumbling spire, but the fighter stays on their tail. A red alarm light flares, indicating a power drain. Another direct hit, and they're finished. He spots a narrow gap between two leaning buildings. There! He shouts, pointing. She sets her jaw, angles the craft, and plunges through the gap with centimeters to spare. The fighter tries to follow but clips a corner of rubble, spiraling out of control. A furious explosion lights the sky behind them. She doesn't waste time celebrating. The cruiser stutters, engines straining as they pull away from the city. Kale glances back, relief mingled with a tension that won't dissipate. He risks a look at Nixara, noticing a faint sheen of sweat on her brow, her lips pressed into a determined line. She's good, he admits silently. Damn good. As they gain altitude, the city shrinks into a war-torn mosaic. The open skies stretch before them, but they're not free yet. She taps in coordinates, her voice low. A hidden stronghold on the outskirts. My last loyal guard might be there. He says nothing, just watches the horizon. Another beep from the console warns that they're running on fumes. The craft rattles. She mutters a curse, pushing it as far as it will go. Eventually, an expanse of rocky terrain comes into view, dotted with craters. A flicker of force field shimmer betrays the outline of a camouflaged base. She brings them down roughly, skidding to a stop on a makeshift landing platform. The engine cuts out in a final wheeze. Guards appear from hidden posts, weapons raised. At once, they recognize their queen, hurrying forward with startled reverence. Kale jumps out, blade in hand, scanning for any sign of treachery. She steps down regally, despite her exhaustion. The guards exchange glances, uncertain whether to shoot or salute. Lower your weapons, she snaps, voice edged with command. They obey, letting her pass. He follows in her wake, ignoring the suspicious glares. Inside the stronghold, she barks orders, setting the guard to secure the perimeter. Rumors of the coup swirl among them, tension thick. Kale stands at the periphery, feeling the weight of 100 gazes. Here she's in her element, commanding loyalty with a single word. But even as she rallies them, he sees the cracks. Her forces are diminished, supplies low. The war has taken its toll on every side. She approaches him, eyes flicking over his weapon. You're still here, human. Are you planning to turn on me now? He gives her a level stare. I need to see this through. Her tail swishes, and she steps closer, her voice dropping. You want an end to the Dominion, don't you? Or do you want me alive? Her purr emerges, subtle but insistent, vibrating in the narrow space between them. He grips the hilt of his blade so hard his knuckles whiten. I want an end to the war. She studies him, her gold eyes unwavering. Then you'll help me reclaim my power. And in return you'll get your peace. He snorts softly. Or my revenge. A half-smile curves her lips, and her ears prick forward as if acknowledging the dual possibility. The line between the two can be very thin, she muses. Then her gaze cuts away, and she gestures for him to follow. They wind through cramped corridors until they reach a command center. She confers with several loyal officers, producing the data she retrieved. Kale stands off to the side, arms folded. A fierce debate ensues in hushed voices. Some question her leadership, worried she's been compromised. Others argue that her presence is their best hope. She silences them all with a sharp command, pointing to the evidence on the console. The names of traitors within the Dominion are laid bare. A final plan takes shape, a strike at the coup's heart, a show of force that only she can lead, proving she is still the rightful queen. If they succeed, the coup collapses, and her throne is restored. Kale listens, realizing this is his moment. He can sabotage her, or push her to end the war once and for all. She catches his eye, a silent question lingering there. He steps forward, ignoring the disapproving stares of her officers. I'm in, he says. Murmurs ripple through the room. She flicks her gaze around, then leans in, every bit the sovereign. We move at dawn. With that, the plan is set. The next hours pass in a flurry of preparation, weapons checks, infiltration strategies, troop deployments. Kale offers insight from his own battles, and though her officers bristle at taking orders from a human, she insists they listen. Tension thickens as the night wears on. Outside, the stronghold hums with activity, soldiers gearing up for a decisive confrontation. Kale stands near a table strewn with hollow maps, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. If this goes right, they could end the coup, and maybe even the war. If it fails, they'll all be dead by morning. Nixara approaches, sliding into his peripheral vision with feline silence. She sets a hand on the table, studying the maps. "You've fought battles like this before," she says, tone quiet. He nods. "Many." She exhales, her purr a faint undercurrent. "Then fight this one with me." He glances at her, noticing the slight tremor in her tail. Her face is calm, but he senses her fear. He should hate her for the destruction her empire wreaked. Yet at this moment, her eyes hold a vulnerability he can't ignore. Without fully understanding why, he places a hand over hers. "You'll owe me," he mutters. She gives a short, humorless laugh. "If we survive, I'll consider it." They linger like that for a moment, the contact warm, charged, before she withdraws, clearing her throat. "Rest. Tomorrow we fight." He finds a corner in the barracks, ignoring the glares from her soldiers. They don't trust him, but he's beyond caring. He leans against the wall, sliding down to a crouch. Across the way, she's speaking with a small group of loyal lieutenants, outlining final details of the strike. Their eyes meet briefly, and he inclines his head, acknowledging her leadership. She returns the faintest nod. Then she disappears into a private chamber, presumably to prepare herself for the challenge ahead. Sleep doesn't come easily. His mind churns with too many questions. Will he betray her at the last moment? Or will he stand beside her, forging a new future from the ashes of war? Each time he closes his eyes, he sees the glow of her tattoos, hears the pulse of her purr. Anger, desire, and regret coil through him in endless loops. He forces himself to doze, though it's restless. Sometime in the night, he senses movement. Opening his eyes, he sees her standing over him, arms folded, silhouette framed by the flickering corridor light. "What do you want?" he mutters, pushing himself upright. She shifts, looking unsure for the first time. "You haven't asked me for anything," she says softly. "Why?" He exhales, standing, feeling the ache in his bones. "Because I don't know what I want yet." Her lips press together, and she reaches out, brushing his cheek with the back of her clawed fingers. It's surprisingly gentle. His heart seizes. "Figure it out soon," she whispers, before turning and walking away. He stands there, breathless, cursing how easily she unravels him. When dawn breaks, the base erupts in a hive of activity. Soldiers assemble in formation, weapons gleaming. She stands at the forefront, armor fitted around her lithe frame, tattoos partially visible beneath protective plating. Her voice rings out, commanding loyalty and courage. Kale stands slightly behind her, sword strapped to his back. The plan is simple but deadly: slip through the Dominion capital's outer defenses, infiltrate the coup's command center, and deliver a decisive blow. She addresses the troops with regal poise, reminding them of their duty to the Ziri people. Then her gaze slides to Kale. "We fight together," she declares, as if forging an unspoken pact. They move out, columns of soldiers traveling in stealth formations across the rocky terrain. Kale rides at her side on a speeder bike, scanning the horizon for threats. The sun rises behind them, casting long shadows. His heart thuds with the knowledge that, within hours, everything could change, for him, for her, for both their worlds. She spares him a sidelong glance, then looks away, focused on the task at hand. He can feel the coiled energy radiating from her, a tension that's part battle readiness, part something else. They reach the Dominion capital's outskirts, encountering light resistance. Her soldiers engage swiftly, subduing guard posts without raising a major alarm. Each clash is fast, brutal, over in seconds. Kale fights with grim efficiency, a testament to years of conflict. She matches him blow for blow, a blur of claws and lethal grace. After securing a perimeter, they converge on a massive tower, the seat of the coup's leadership. Smoke rises from the city, the ongoing war echoing in the distance. She motions for them to split into squads, each assigned to crucial points of infiltration. Kale remains close to her, forging ahead into the tower's lobby, where a line of heavily armed Ziri traders awaits. The ensuing fight is vicious. Laser fire scorches the air. She leaps into the fray, purring loud enough that even her foes hesitate in confusion. Kale exploits their momentary shock, cutting them down one by one. She spins, swiping with razor precision, not sparing a second glance for the bodies that fall behind her. Blood spatters on polished floors, and the reek of ozone thickens. They storm an elevator shaft, forced to climb when the power is cut. She scales the cables with effortless agility, motioning for him to follow. His muscles burn with the effort, but he refuses to lag behind. Halfway up, a barrage of plasma blasts rains down from above. She scampers sideways, pressing against the shaft's wall. He follows suit, hooking his arm around a cable to steady himself. One of her soldiers screams, tumbling into the darkness. She snarls, eyes blazing with fury, then pushes onward, determined to reach the top. After grueling minutes, they emerge on the command level. She pries the doors open, and he dives into the corridor, sword flashing. The hallway is deserted, eerily silent. She gestures for caution, leading them through a labyrinth of metallic corridors. At last, they reach a grand chamber. Tall windows overlook the battered city. A group of Ziri dignitaries and officers stand in a loose semicircle, glaring as Nixera enters. One steps forward, an older male with elaborate tattoos marking him as a high-ranking official. He sneers. "So you crawl back, dethroned queen." She lifts her chin, stepping forward with lethal grace. "I never left," she says, voice a resonant challenge. Kale sees the faint quiver in her tail, a sign of suppressed rage. The official smirks. "You were too weak to hold power. We seized what you abandoned." Her purr rises, a menacing growl. "You seized nothing but your own doom." She launches herself at him, claws out. The chamber explodes into chaos as officers scramble to either fight or flee. Kale moves in tandem with her, blocking strikes, parrying blows, stepping over fallen bodies. She finds her target, this traitorous leader, and locks him in combat, tail lashing as they trade vicious blows. Kale battles the others, but keeps an eye on her. She's unstoppable, fury incarnate, until a cunning move by the official slams her into a console. She lands hard, momentarily stunned. The traitor raises a blade, eyes gleaming with triumph. Kale lunges, tackling the official before he can strike. They crash to the floor, wrestling for the weapon. Nixera shakes off her daze, surging back into the fight, claws raking across the traitor's face. He screams, dropping the blade, and Kale pins him down. "Finish it!" Kale snarls, expecting her to deliver the killing blow. She hesitates, breath ragged, eyes blazing with hatred. Then her expression twists into something more complex. She lowers her claws. "No," she says, voice trembling with a fury that transcends murder. "He'll answer for his crimes before the Dominion. Publicly." Kale's eyes flicker with surprise, but he lets her have it. She steps back, allowing loyal soldiers to secure the traitor. The other officers lie defeated, some captured, others dead. It's done. She stands amid the carnage, shoulders rising and falling, hair wild around her face. Kale turns to her, expecting some declaration of victory. Instead, she steps close, pressing a trembling hand to his chest. Her purr resonates in a deep, exhausted wave. "It's over," she whispers, though it sounds like she's trying to convince herself. He meets her gaze. The chamber is silent save for the whir of machinery and the groans of the wounded. He can feel her heartbeat hammering in time with his, a primal bond forged in blood and desperation. She leans against him, tail coiling around his leg in a gesture that surprises them both. In that charged moment, something snaps. Perhaps it's relief, or raw adrenaline, or the unstoppable force that's been building between them since the first clash in the throne room. He cups her face, and she closes her eyes, letting out a ragged breath. The kiss that follows is neither gentle nor tender. It's a collision of two forces that have fought, bled, and nearly destroyed each other. His grip tightens around her, Her nails dig into his arms. It's a struggle for dominance even in this act, filled with the taste of victory and iron, regret and longing. When they break apart, panting, the entire chamber seems to hold its breath. Her soldiers stare, some in shock, others in awe. She glances around, pushing Kale away just enough to regain her composure. Her voice rises, regal once more. The coup has failed. The Dominion stands under my rule. Applause and cheers break out among her loyalists, and she steps forward to address them, shoulders squared, chin high. Kale stands at her side, sword sheathed now, wondering at the path that led them here. In the aftermath, the traitors are bound and paraded before the Dominion. She makes a speech to the battered populace, promising an end to the internal strife. Kale observes from a distance. He knows this is just one step. The war with his people remains unresolved. But as she looks at him, he senses a shift in her priorities. She beckons him forward, commanding him to stand beside her. He does, arms folded, watching the crowd. Some hiss, unsettled by the human's presence. Others are too tired of bloodshed to protest. She addresses the crowd again, voice reverberating through the city's loudspeakers. "We have bled too long," she declares, letting her purr underscore her words. "We need a truce, something more than the endless cycle of death." A murmur spreads through the onlookers. She holds up a hand, silencing them. Her eyes slide to Kale, and he feels the weight of her next words. "We do not have to love each other," she continues, "but we must live side by side, or perish together." He feels the tension in his spine. This might be the moment. If she fails to keep her promise, if she reverts to conquest, he'll finish what he started. But if she stays true, maybe there's hope. In the days that follow, she works to restore some semblance of order. Trials for the coup's leaders begin, and the populace slowly adapts to her return. Kale stands as a silent guardian, grappling with his conflicting loyalties. He hears reports of negotiations with human territories, cautious but not dismissive. She calls him into private meetings, asking questions about what his people need to even consider a truce. Each conversation simmers with the same undercurrent that sparked that desperate kiss in the coup's command chamber. They keep their distance publicly, but behind closed doors, the tension explodes in heated arguments that often blur into something more. He resists, she pushes. She resists, he insists. It's a constant battle of wills, fueled by their shared victory and the ghosts of all they've lost. Neither wants to yield, but something unspoken grows each time they clash, a bond that transcends hatred. Finally, on the night she's to make a grand address to both the Dominion and the human factions via hololink, she paces in the old throne room, newly repaired but still showing scars of the siege. Kale watches from the shadows, arms folded. She hesitates at the dais, her usual confidence faltering. His heart clenches. Stepping forward, he places a hand on her shoulder, feeling the taut muscles beneath her elegant armor. "You're the queen," he says quietly, though his tone carries that familiar challenge. She exhales, turning to face him. "I am," she whispers, "but everything has changed." He studies the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Then change with it," he replies, voice low, feeling the pull that's haunted him since their first clash. She nods once, then surprises him by reaching out, hooking a claw gently into his collar, pulling him in. Their kiss this time is still fierce, but laced with a new understanding, a fragile acceptance that the lines between them have blurred, perhaps forever. When she steps onto the dais to deliver her speech, he stands at her side, aware that he's never been so close to an enemy, nor so unwilling to move away. Her address resonates across the capital, then streams to outlying worlds. She speaks of unity, of building a future free from the endless cycle of violence. He can sense the pushback, the disbelief, even the hatred from both sides. Yet her voice holds a steel that will not be denied. By the time she finishes, the throne room is silent. She stands there, gaze unwavering, purse silent but her strength radiating. He steps forward. The hush deepens. Then he kneels, not in subservience, but as a gesture of a soldier acknowledging a leader he's chosen to follow. She rests a clawed hand on his shoulder. Rise, she says softly, and when he stands, the expression in her gold eyes is one of profound relief. A wave of hushed astonishment spreads through those assembled. Perhaps they see the seeds of something new growing from the ashes of war. The next day, terms are drawn up for a precarious peace. Skirmishes still rage at the fringes, and old hatreds don't vanish overnight. But a framework emerges, with both Dominion and human territories agreeing to at least talk, if not embrace each other wholeheartedly. She presides over the negotiations with a regal bearing, and Kale stands as her enforcer, sentinel, and occasional conscience. Some humans revile him for standing beside the Ziri Queen, but he's earned enough respect on the battlefield that they begrudgingly listen. Weeks turn into a tense lull in open hostilities. The Dominion's battered infrastructure begins a slow reconstruction, guided by her firm hand. Human emissaries arrive, suspicious but willing to hear her out. Each meeting becomes a battleground of diplomacy, with both sides testing the other's limits. Through it all, she and Kale maintain a delicate balance, their personal battles punctuated by stolen moments that reveal the depth of their bond. One evening, as the setting sun bathes the repaired palace in a crimson glow, she finds him on a balcony overlooking the city. He leans against the railing, gazing at the flickering lights below. She approaches with that silent grace, tail swaying, tattoos almost alive under the dying light. "You've done what you set out to do," she says softly, standing beside him. "Is this revenge enough?" He closes his eyes, letting the breeze stir his hair. "I didn't expect it to look like this," he admits, voice heavy with the weight of so many fallen. "But maybe it's what we need." She nods, a faint smirk on her lips. "Then you should stay." He turns, searching her face. Those gold eyes gleam with a complicated swirl of emotion. "I never asked for a place at your side." She lifts her chin, defiant as ever. "You didn't have to." Then she pulls him close, her purr a gentle rumble, no longer purely seductive or threatening, but something that resonates with comfort. He wraps an arm around her waist, his other hand tracing the intricate lines of her tattoos. Her ears twitch, and she looks up at him with an intimacy that would have been unthinkable when they first met. He presses his forehead to hers. "You're a hard woman to trust." She smiles, a flicker of mischief dancing across her features. "You're a hard man to tame." Neither offers further explanation, because none is needed. This moment is a culmination of everything they've survived and fought for, a fragile union forged in blood and tempered by desire. Weeks later, the day finally comes for a formal declaration that the Dominion and the human territories have reached a ceasefire. It's an event that draws skeptics and supporters alike. She stands on a raised platform in the newly rebuilt central square, addressing a crowd that spans both species. The hush is punctuated by the hum of hover cameras. Kale stands to her left, an ever-present shadow. As she speaks of unity, her voice unwavering, he can sense the tension in the crowd, see how some flinch at every mention of peace. But no one draws a weapon. No one riots. He catches her eye, and she gives the faintest nod. When she finishes her speech, thunderous applause mingles with pockets of stunned silence. But the seeds are planted. She descends from the platform, and Kale is there to meet her. Soldiers clear a path, uncertain how to regard the pair. A handful of human delegates approach, each greeting them with cautious respect. The day ends without violence, and though the future remains unpredictable, it's a tangible step towards something else. Later that night, in her private quarters, she sheds the trappings of royalty, removing her ornate crown, letting her hair cascade free. He stands by the window, the city lights shimmering below. Without a word, she crosses the room, and they meet in a fierce embrace, every ounce of conflict and passion simmering to the surface. Their lips collide, breath mingling. This time, there's no pretense of combat in it. It's surrender, yes, but mutual and willing. When they finally part, she murmurs, "You'll stay with me?" He answers by running his thumb across her lower lip, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Try to stop me." Dawn breaks over a city that still bears the scars of war, but now pulses with the promise of rebirth. She and Kale emerge to address the day's challenges together. Her tail twitches in subtle annoyance when an aide complains about resource shortages, but she deals with it. He steps in to negotiate a security detail. They move as if they'd been doing this for years, forging a path that neither could have walked alone. Once enemies, now something far more complex, partners, lovers, possibly even co-rulers of a new era, if the Dominion is willing to accept it. Each day brings fresh obstacles. There are attempts on her life. Rogue human brigades sabotage supply lines. Disgruntled Ziri loyalists scheme to oust her, believing her new approach too soft. She faces them all with unwavering resolve, her purr rumbling with authority during negotiations, her claws bared in the occasional skirmish. Kale stands beside her, the threat of his blade ever present. Some see them and whisper that it's blasphemy, a human in the Queen's inner circle. But others sense the quiet strength they share, the synergy that could heal their fractured worlds. Eventually, tensions begin to ease. Trade routes reopen under mutual protection. Diplomats shuttle between the Dominion and human strongholds, carrying cautious messages of cooperation. For the first time in years, the front lines grow quiet. Soldiers return to families who never thought they'd see them again. The reconstruction picks up speed, and pockets of prosperity bloom in once devastated territories. Late one evening, Nixera stands on a balcony overlooking the palace courtyard, her tail wrapped around her ankles in a contemplative pose. Kale approaches from behind, the sound of his footfalls echoing on polished marble. Without turning, she speaks, her voice carrying on the night breeze. I never thought I'd see this day. He steps beside her, resting his forearms on the stone railing. A day without bombs dropping? Without an army at the gates? She nods, exhaling softly. Yes. I thought the war would consume us all. I never imagined a future where I could stand here without looking over my shoulder. He glances at her, noting the subtle lines of fatigue around her eyes, the persistent tension in the set of her shoulders. But you're still looking, he says gently. She tilts her head, giving him a sidelong glance. Old habits, she admits. In my world, power is always a target. He reaches out, tracing the outline of a tattoo on her arm. She shivers slightly at his touch, pressing closer. Not if we guard each other's backs, he murmurs. She lifts her gaze to his, a thousand unspoken confessions dancing in her eyes. Then guard mine, she whispers. Always. They stand there in silence, letting the weight of those words settle. In that moment, the city below seems peaceful, the hush broken only by distant night patrols. She leans into him, the purr in her throat rising like a gentle lullaby. He wraps an arm around her waist, pulling her in. The sense of belonging is startling, not something either of them expected when blades first crossed. But here they are, an unlikely pair forged by conflict and tempered by desire. At dawn, a formal ceremony is held in the palace courtyard. She appears in resplendent regalia, her hair braided with delicate metal rings, her armor polished. Kale stands at her side in simple leathers, his blade at his hip. Representatives from human and Ziri factions alike gather, uneasy but determined. She delivers a proclamation ending martial law, inviting a new council to shape policies. Kale notices the wavering expressions in the crowd, skepticism, hope, fear. Change is never easy. Yet the fact that they stand here, listening, is a victory in itself. When the ceremony concludes, applause mingles with hushed conversation. She steps down from the dais, and Kale moves to follow, but a group of her closest advisors intercepts her, discussing immediate concerns. He waits, scanning the faces. A few meet his gaze with guarded respect. Others scowl, still seeing him as an invader. Eventually, the crowd disperses, and she weaves her way back to him. I'm surrounded by so many voices, she says, frustration tinging her tone. It's hard to think. He rests a hand on her shoulder. They'll come once they see results. She nods, exhaling. Then, in a rare moment of open affection, she slides her hand into his. They walk together through the palace halls, ignoring the curious stares. Within the private recesses of the grand structure, they can exist with fewer masks. In a small, sun-dappled courtyard, she stops, turning to face him. "What now, Kale?" she asks, voice quiet. He studies her, remembering the day he first saw her in that throne room, poised and lethal. How everything changed in a heartbeat. "Whatever we want," he replies simply. Her lips twitch in a small smile. She steps close enough that he can feel the warmth emanating from her body. "I want this peace," she says. "And I want you." The frankness of her admission stuns him momentarily. He cups her jaw, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "Then you have me," he murmurs, leaning in until their foreheads touch. Her purr vibrates softly, a sign of trust and contentment he never thought he'd witness from her. That evening, in the privacy of her chambers, they talk long into the night. She speaks of her childhood, groomed for power, taught to crush enemies without mercy. He shares fragments of his life before the war, the family he lost. They don't dwell in sorrow. Each confesses in the same blunt, combative manner as everything else they do. Tears don't fall, but the rawness of their words carries more weight than any lament. By the time the moon climbs high, an unspoken depth of understanding emerges between them. In the weeks that follow, the Dominion transforms under her guidance. She restructures policies to focus on rebuilding rather than conquest. Human diplomats, once bitter enemies, come to the palace to negotiate lasting peace. Kale's presence is vital. He translates human needs, offers insights that bridge misunderstandings. Each negotiation is fraught, but progress is tangible. They navigate threats from extremist factions on both sides, stamping out sabotage attempts that threaten to reignite the war. At last, a day comes when the main human leadership visits the palace for a final summit. Tensions run high. Armed escorts line every corridor. She greets them in the throne room, flanked by her newly appointed council. Kale stands just behind her, a silent sentinel, meeting the hard stares of the human delegates with unwavering resolve. Hours of talks follow, culminating in a fragile but momentous treaty. Signatures are inked, data crystals exchanged. The war, at least in its most official capacity, is declared over. She and Kale exit the throne room, followed by applause that seems hesitant but hopeful. Once in the corridor, she exhales, leaning against a gilded column. He raises a brow. "Victory at last?" She offers a weary smile. "A start, at least." He steps closer, brushing her hair aside, noticing how the tension has etched lines of exhaustion into her expression. "Your empire," he says quietly. "But it's ours now, isn't it?" She nods, resting a hand on his chest, her claws lightly pressing the fabric. "I suppose so." He tilts her chin up, gaze intense. "Then let's see it through." She purrs softly, letting him guide her away from the bustling corridors toward a secluded terrace. The sunset paints the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, reflecting off the palace's golden spires. They stand together at the balustrade, the city stretching below, flags of both Dominion and human enclaves fluttering in the breeze. She slides an arm around his waist, and he draws her close. For a moment neither speaks. They simply watch the horizon, each lost in the enormity of what they've achieved, and what lies ahead. Finally, she breaks the silence. "I had a vision, once, of ruling the galaxy. Now I just want to protect this fragile peace." He turns to her, a rare smile softening his features. "Maybe that's what real power is, protecting, not crushing." She laughs, a sound tinted with genuine warmth rather than sarcasm. "I never thought I'd learn that from a human who nearly killed me." He brushes his lips against her temple, inhaling the faint scent that lingers in her hair. She leans into him, purr rising. "And I never thought I'd find something worth living for in the heart of my greatest enemy," he admits. Her tail curls around his leg, a silent affirmation of the bond they share. In the final glow of the sun, they stay locked in that embrace, breathing in each other's presence, each second an acknowledgement of the journey that began with violence and ended in understanding. It feels like a conclusion, yet it isn't an end, because what they've built is something that continues each day, forging alliances and shaping a new era. But for now, as the last rays of light fade over the palace, they share a moment of stillness, hearts beating in tandem. When she finally whispers his name, the words carry no command or taunt. Only a quiet sense of belonging, of accepting what they've created. And that, he realizes, is the only ending he wants. The war is over, the treaty stands, and the future is theirs to shape. They draw each other into a final, lingering kiss, sealing what fate has decreed from the moment her purr first rattled his senses in that moonlit throne room. It's done. It's real. And it's enough.